Hello, the program Truth in Details is on air. I am its host, Askard Zaldanov. A project that tells in detail about situations, incidents and crimes. With today's issue, we begin a series of journalistic investigations about the so-called Kospayev gang. Brothers Eldos and Yedos Kospayev, as well as their accomplices, kept businessmen of Almaty and the Almaty region in fear for many years. They acted confidently and brazenly, introducing themselves as trusted persons of the late Bolata Nazarbayev. They squeezed out any type of business they liked. But the starting point for the collapse of the Kospayev gang was the case of the Abdagaparov family, co-owners of the Parmejana Group company. Sultana Tarakbava will tell you how, when and in what way the Abdagaparov family was forced to transfer their property to the bandits. Isntai City is a premium residential complex located on the banks of the Isntai River in one of the most prestigious and expensive areas of Almaty. Low-rise buildings with their own terraces and courtyards, luxurious townhouses and villas with panoramic windows and mountain views. An atmosphere of maximum comfort, security and exclusivity. The first apartments in the complex were commissioned back in 2018. And now their price reaches almost 2 million tenge per square meter. In a word, an elite property. And everything would be fine only in July 2021, the news thundered. The owner of the construction company AV Construction, who was building the complex, Алмаса Абдыгаппарова, was arrested on suspicion of embezzlement on an especially large scale. A year later, he was found guilty and sentenced to 7 years in prison. The place of the general director of AV Construction was taken by Almasa's wife Olga Abdagaparva. However, in February 2025, she was also arrested. A strange story, isn't it? Алмаса Абдыгаппарова is known in his circle as a conscientious entrepreneur who has been steadily growing his business and reputation since 2011. In wider circles, Алмаса is known as the owner of the Almaty restaurant chain Parmejana Group. What is the real reason for the arrest of Алмasa and Olga Abdagaparva? And what really happened? Let's figure it out together. A little background. Алмаса Abdagaparva was born in 1979 in Almaty. He graduated from the Kazakh State Academy of Management, specializing in international economic relations. From the age of 19, he worked in international companies. In 2006, he opened his first business, a company for the processing and sale of petroleum products. In 2011, he sold the business to a Russian company, and with the proceeds he opened the first restaurant of the Parmejana Group chain, which later became his calling card. In 2014, under the auspices of Parmejana Group, the Design Architectural Bureau AV Architect was founded, which for several years was engaged in the implementation of private and urban projects. In 2016, Алмаса Abdagaparova, as part of his own construction company Avconstruction, began to implement perhaps the most ambitious of his projects, the premium residential complex Isntai City, and almost immediately felt the attempts of raider interference in the business. OPGA began in 2016. Obijan Dostan, who worked as a lawyer for Алмаса in the Anstrash company, he said that he wanted to introduce Алмаса to the right people. Dostan Obijan brought two people to the meeting with Алмаса Abdagaparova. The first was Begzed Usanov, the son-in-law of Bolata Nazarbayev, the younger brother of the then current president of Kazakhstan. The second was called Елдос Коспаев. Елдос Коспаев, nicknamed Людоед, was a security official and Bolata Nazarbayev's right hand. Kospayev received his nickname for his brutal management style and explosive character. In 2021, a video appeared on the internet in which Kospayev beats a man right in a sports club. As it turned out later, a stranger, a Turkish citizen, simply accidentally parked his car in a parking space that was tacitly considered Kospayev's. These raiders, they did not come right away. They did not come to bare ground completely. They came when Алмаса Абдыгаппарова, through his network of restaurants, began to successfully sell apartments in this residential complex. At that time, Алмаз and Olga launched an advertising campaign for participation in shared construction in Isntai City, which they successfully promoted in the Parmigiana Group restaurant chain. Since the chain is also in demand, an elite restaurant, the corresponding public went there, and these apartments began to sell like hot cakes. And then Елдос Коспаев appeared. And completely unexpectedly, not all from where, allegedly there with such, well, at first brief, yes, manners, that you will not implement the project without us. You will not get permission without us. You will not do this without us. You will not do that without us. Having offered his candidacy as an investor and having promised assistance with the approval of the project in the Akimat of Almaty, Елдос Коспаев insisted that Алмаз include him and Biksit Usanov in the founders of 2AV Construction. This was the very offer that was impossible to refuse. Understanding who was behind Елдос Коспаев, Алмаса Abdыгаппарова was forced to rewrite 10% of the company to him, and another 30% to Biksit Usanov's wife Kunduz Nazarbaeva, since Usanov himself at that time held the position of deputy head of the Department of State Revenues for the city of Almaty, that is, he was a civil servant and did not have the right to conduct private business. Having assumed the role of co-owner of the company, Елдос Коспаев quickly put his cronies in key positions, and he himself began to buy up apartments in the residential complex under construction at a reduced price for the purpose of subsequent resale. He bought at a reduced price and resold them there at a much higher price. Indeed, at a much higher price, putting the profit in his own pocket. That is, he thereby plundered the company. The same money should have gone further into construction. That is, this is not something that cannot be called an investment, it is theft. In fact, with the arrival of Kospayev and his team, the company's business rapidly declined. And if the first part of the residential complex was commissioned on time in 2018, then problems arose with the construction of the second. Construction slowed down noticeably. In addition to the financial part, the personnel also suffered. While the brainchild of Алмаса Abdыгаппарова, Avakan Strachan, was being systematically plundered, Елдос Коспаев from the very first days began to terrorize the company's employees. As soon as he and his people appeared at AV Construction, they began to harass the entire company, all the people who had worked with Алмаз for a long time. Had a lot of work experience and so on. They fired almost all the people. And what did they do to those who did not agree with the opinion of Kospayev Елдос and his accomplices? They intimidated them, to the point that they beat these people. Just imagine, day after day, coming to work, people face not only moral pressure, which in itself is a serious factor for stress, but also a real threat of physical violence. For many employees of AV Construction, the appearance of Елдос Коспаев became a real nightmare. Until 2021, the Abdagaparva family continued to own 35% of AV Construction. The rest had long been rewritten to Kospayev and his accomplices. Алмаса Abdыгаппарова tried to keep the company afloat and fulfill his obligations to shareholders until the very end. However, in 2021, the situation changed dramatically. In 2021, the new goal of Bolata Nazarbaev's protege was to establish 100% control over the AV Construction company, which required squeezing out the remaining 35%. Registered to Алмаса Abdыгапparov's mother Salaj Spekova. From an open letter from Алмаса Abdыгаппарова to the President of Kazakhstan Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. At the beginning of 2021, realizing that I would no longer be allowed to work normally, I decided to sell 35% of the company, registered to my mother, Jun Uzbekbekova, to solve. We agreed with Елдос Коспаев on its sale price of $3.5 million. In March, the 10% share was re-registered. The remaining 25% was supposed to be re-registered after paying $2.5 million and withdrawing my personal guarantee from the bank. But on July 24, 2021, I was arrested by the Almaty City Police Department on suspicion of embezzling $1 million, which I received as payment for a 10% share, which I re-registered to a relative of Елдос Коспаев. Timur Tanashev and partner Dostan Obijan. They took 40% of the share. These 40% were rewritten to Bolata Nazarbayev's daughter, Kunduz Nazarbayeva. Then they began to gradually rewrite and thus took 75% of the share. And then they wanted to take over the entire company. You see, this was his calling card, this project. People went for it, and they left it to the last. And until the very end, while the sales were going on, because they understood that the business card, well, who is Елдос Коспаев, who knows? He positions himself as, yes, he has a colossal fortune, yes, he has a pitchfork and so on. But in reality, we understand how this, well, let's say, was acquired. And therefore, well, who would go for him? Everyone knew Алмаса Абдыгаппарова that he himself was the creator of his restaurants, his chain. That is, this is a person who went for him, and they held on to him until the very end, and then, when the need for him disappeared, roughly speaking, well, I'm speaking frankly, then they began to squeeze out the last 25% from him. According to Алмаса Абдыгаппарова, immediately after his arrest, Timur Tanashev voiced Елдос Коспаев's conditions to him. If Алмаз gives $4.5 million and rewrites the rest of the share in the business by the morning of the next day, the criminal case against him will be dismissed. At the same time, pressure began to be put on Almaz's wife and elderly parents. When my son was imprisoned, they constantly told us, passed on through people, that we should keep quiet, that we should not speak out, that otherwise it would be bad for my son in the pretrial detention center and that little could happen to him and that it would be bad for us. And even then they threatened Olga Abdagaparva that they would deal with her. In order to attract public attention to Almaz's case, the Abdagaparov family began actively turning to the media. However, this only worsened the situation. Елдос Коспаев repeatedly called to the Avakonstrash office and Almaz's father, Isntai City, an elderly man, let us remember, to talk like men. In this office. Right here. And so, having invited him, Kospayev Fildos said that Bolata Nazarbayev was very unhappy that we, our family, me, Olga, my husband, were constantly appearing in the media. We were talking about that, well, about those outrages that were happening in the company, that Kospayev Fildos had put our son in jail, that he had organized this, and so on, and that if we did not stop, things would get very bad. At first, even despite the endless stream of threats that rained down on the family, Solid Jean Uzbekova still tried to keep her last share in the company in order to defend her son's case. However, in response to this, the family received a statement that the share could be rewritten without the knowledge of the Abdagaparovs, but in that case no one would be able to help the Almaz, who was in prison. And what did they say? That it was necessary to transfer the share, rewrite the share to their person, and that if we did this, then they could help in the diamond case in the future. And if we don't do this, they will still rewrite this share, reducing this initial capital, that is, diluting the share. And that even then we will not gain anything from this and that we will not be able to help our son in any way. And they said again that you never know what could happen to him. In the end, tired of the pressure and threats and seriously fearing for the life of her son, who was in jail, Solid Uzbekova was forced to give in to the cannibal. I then told this offended man, give me a written guarantee that if we agree to rewrite this share, then you will free my son Almaz. He told me, "I cannot give any written guarantees, but Елдос Коспаев, he will fulfill his promise." On September 15, 2021, Notary Kospayev and then Director of AV Instruction Rawan Babayev came straight to Alma's parents' home. Notary Altabasarov, when he showed me all these papers, he said nothing, did not explain anything, did not say anything. And the buyer of this share, I only learned the name of the buyer from these documents. It was some kind of insult, and he was not present at this purchase and sale. Suspecting something was wrong, the woman at the last moment took a photo of the agreement on the transfer of rights, where the signature of the second participant in the transaction, Rustam Askerbek, was missing. As it turned out later, this was the right decision. After that, the family had only one thing left to do: wait for the cannibal to fulfill his part of the oral agreement and the diamonds to be released. However, time passed, but nothing changed. We waited a week, a second week, for our son to be released, but this did not happen. And then me, Olga and my husband, turned to the media, appealed to our head of state to order how the redder seizure of this 25% share occurred. And we told everything as it was. And from that moment on, pressure and threats began again. On July 5, 2022, District Court No. 2 of the Mid-Aid District of Almaty City issued a verdict in the case of Алмаса Абдыгаппарова. The businessman was sentenced to 7 years under Article 189, embezzlement or misappropriation of entrusted property. Realizing that they could no longer count on the help of the cannibal and his pack, the family decided to fight for justice on their own. This is where that very photo of the agreement on the transfer of a share in the company, filled out in violation of the rules, came in handy. Having filed a lawsuit for the illegal appropriation of 25% of Ava Construction, Suzana Spekova still managed to win them back through the court, although not the first time. I lost the first case, I also lost the second case, I won the third case. They filed a cassation appeal to the Supreme Court, but I won there too and the 25% was returned to me. At the same time, the Financial Monitoring Agency became interested in the history of the AV Instruction Company. And already on July 14, just a week after the verdict was passed on Алмаса Abdыгаппарова, the first 4 associates of Елдос Коспаев were arrested. The rest, including himself, went on the run and left Kazakhstan. It seemed that everything was gradually getting better. The court decision to return 25% of Olga Spakova's construction company was made in September 2022, and already in November, Olga, Алмаса Abdagapparov's wife, was appointed to the position of general director. This was done primarily with the aim of resuming the construction of the Isntai City complex. I remained the only, legal founder of this company. I was 76 years old at the time, and it was hard for me to do all this work. Therefore, I suggested that Olga take the place of director of AV construction in order to resume the company's work, so that construction work could continue, so that we could fulfill our obligations to customers and complete the Isntai City projects. In 2022, the Financial Monitoring Agency launched a pre-trial investigation into the creation of an organized crime group involving Елдос Коспаев and 10 more people. And on September 6, 2023, the KNB carried out an operation to detain the members of the organized crime group, including the cannibal himself, in Cyprus and transport them to Kazakhstan. The pre-trial investigation into the Елдос Коспаев organized crime group case lasted almost a year and a half and was transferred to court only in January 2024. The case materials amounted to more than 500 volumes and 8 terabytes of evidence. At this point, I would like to move on to a logical happy ending. where all the guilty will be deservedly punished, and the victims will receive legal satisfaction. However, another unexpected turn occurred in this case. On February 7, 2025, when the trial of Елдос Коспаев and his accomplices was still underway, investigative bodies in Astana detained Olga Abdagaparva on charges of large-scale fraud. The fact is that Olga Abdagaparva also made a major contribution to exposing Kospayev's organized crime group, since she also testified both at the pre-trial stage and in court. According to the lawyer of Almaz and Olga Abdagaparva, Olga was regularly threatened not to testify against Kospayev's organized crime group. And an amazing coincidence, the woman was arrested on the same day as she spoke out against the gang at a closed trial in Astana. Apparently, Kospayev and his assistants decided not to reinvent the wheel and used the method already tested on Алмаса Абдыгаппарова. They fabricated a case out of thin air. I can definitely say that it has no basis, because all those relationships that form the basis of this criminal case, they are exhausted by the civil decisions that have been made. Solet Juspekova, Olga Abdagaparova's mother-in-law, is also sure that the criminal case against her daughter-in-law has no basis. Moreover, during the pre-trial investigation, no audit of the construction company or the necessary examinations were conducted. I, so to speak, on my own initiative, ordered several audits. And this audit showed that all the money that came in during Olga's directorship, they were all purposefully directed to construction and installation work, to payments, salaries of employees, that is, to all those necessary expenses that, to bring economic activity to construction. Nevertheless, Olga Abdagaparva has been under house arrest for more than 6 months. She is deprived of the opportunity to work, while she has 2 children and her husband's elderly parents to support. Everything that is happening to the Abdagaparva family proves that Елдос Коспаев's resources are still not exhausted. Despite the fact that in January of this year the court issued a verdict in the organized crime case, Алмаса Абдыгаппаров continues to serve his sentence in the penal colony, and recently he was denied parole under another absurd pretext. Almaz did not provide a certificate of commendation, and yet the family does not stop fighting and hoping that sooner or later justice will prevail. Of course, like every person, I am waiting for justice to come, that after the verdict was passed on Kospayev, Елдос and his accomplices, justice will prevail. They will finally release my son. And that the case that was opened against my daughter Olga will be closed due to lack of corpus delicti. It is simply unrealistic to fit everything into one issue from hundreds of volumes of the criminal case and many testimonies. Therefore, watch the continuation of the story of the Kospayev gang in the following issues. The truth is in the details.